Welcome to the latest episode of Sports Bazaar with myself, Mick Malloy, and Titus O'Reilly, who is still on a deep dive into the America's Cup. Where did we leave it? I can't recall.
Navigating deep waters, to use a nautical term.
Sure.
And where we left it is an Englishman by the name of James Lloyd Ashbury had challenged in 1870 and in 1871, and he had gone home very unhappy.
Because they kept changing the rules on it.
He felt they kept changing the rules. He felt like that they were racing multiple boats against him. They were doing everything, and he accused them of this is the New York Yacht Club, of unsportsmanlike conduct.
Yes.
And was furious at them and went home, and it divided England and the British from America.
Sure.
And the British suddenly had no interest in challenging for the America's Cup. So it's at the point where, in history, where you would say the America's Cup could have just gone away and been nothing.
Sure.
Except for the Canadians.
So they put their hand up.
They put their hand up. So in 1876, at the point where there hasn't been a race for about 5 years, they're starting to say, is anyone ever going to challenge? The British they're just frosty. They are like, your partner on a long car drive. They're not talking to you.
It's not like the British to accuse anyone of cheating. Ashes anyone. So
they're all furious. They're not talking to them. So while they're doing it, the New York Yacht Club start to think, we might need to be a little bit more...
less cheaty?
Well, a bit nicer to the challenger if we're going to get people to even challenge. And what
was the last one? They just said we're going to race as many boats as we like.
Yeah, so originally it was, first we'll race a fleet against you. So, it'll be you versus 15 other boats. Yeah. Then they said, we'll race your boat, you can have one boat, and we'll pick on the day.
On the day which one we want.
Which one from our fleet.
According to conditions.
Yeah, so if it was a light wind day, you would put a boat that was good in light winds. If it was a choppy day, and that's what they did.
How did they think this was... okay.
Well, the reason they kind of had that view is they viewed, I think wrongly, that when the America sailed originally against the British in the original one, that it was them against a fleet. But it wasn't really. They were just one of a fleet. It wasn't a match race back then.
Correct.
And George Schuyler, you'll remember, who was the guy that wrote the title of deed and who they kept going back for... He was the last remaining of the American syndicate. They kept going back to him and asking for his interpretation of the rules, and he kept not siding with the British. He kept saying, you guys are cheating. And he comes up again here because this is really the transition where we move into the America's Cup becoming what it is today in terms of its format, but also we start to see the Americans put in some of the things that make it pretty hard to win.
Okay.
So with no one wanting to challenge, the Canadians actually say, we are going to challenge. They say, we'll come. And it was a guy called Major Charles Gifford. He's the Vice Commodore of the Royal Canadian Yacht Club. He was the challenger. Now, the big difference here, which really shocked the Americans, was the Royal Canadian Yacht Club is not a ocean-going racing club.
Right.
It races on the Great Lakes between Canada and America. Inland racing, freshwater racing. The boat they send is called the Countess of Dufferin, and it was very rushed in production. And this is how it's described by the New York Yacht Club when it shows up. It says, she had fresh water written all over her. Her sail set like a purser's shirt on a handspike. And her hull lacked finish, being as rough as a nutmeg grater. So a purser's shirt is the person that holds the money on a ship.
Right.
So it just means it's very loose and flowy.
It's a big sledge in nautical terms.
I was about to say, I read it in its original form because it's such a... It's, billows like a purser's shirt. Yeah, exactly. This is at a time, it's hull is all rough. It's wood and rough. Yeah. This is a time when the Americans are starting to make their hulls out of metal.
Right.
And shining them. So they cut through the water.
The Canadians have turned up with like a Viking ship.
Yeah, basically. And so they're going...
Game of Thronesy.
Yeah. Now, the Countess of Dufferin's the last ever...
Who's she?
This is the Canadian
but who's
ship.
she?
I don't know who the Countess of Dufferin is. I think it's, because they're still British, obviously, the Canadians. Oh, this is sloppy research from me once again.
You've let yourself down.
I want to apologise. Now, it's the last schooner.
Let's get a fact check on the Countess of Dufferin.
This is the last schooner to ever challenge for the Cup. Now, I know after this, sloops become popular.
Yeah.
Now, I know that will mean a lot to you and I, so I did look it up. A schooner's got 2 masts.
Yeah.
A sloop has 1 mast. There's lots of other differences, but that's the main one. So we're getting into what you see now, 1 mast instead of 2, right? So the New York Yacht Club was so keen, they accepted this challenge, even though everyone was like, this is not going to be
Well, they accepted it because they knew they could beat it easily.
Well, 1, they knew they could beat it, and 2, no one else was, because of their
That's
antics, everyone else was like, nah. Anyway, so it shows up, and they do decide, and this is one thing that is, a couple of things that this does achieve, this race, is the New York Yacht Club decide that they will waive the customary 6-month notice period that they normally have for a challenge, so they can usually build a ship.
Yeah.
So they waive that. But also they agree...
Gee, they're confident.
They're confident.
Pretty
also
confident.
They agree, and this becomes is important and a nice thing for them to do. They name a single defending yacht to meet the challenge. So this is where we get 1 boat on 1 boat for the future.
Do they name it in advance, or do they have their own playoff system?
No, they have their own playoff system. So basically what happens is Americans all race against each other, and whoever is their fastest boat, they name. But so finally you're not competing against whoever they pick on the day. Anyway, the New York Yacht Club is so desperate that they win easily. They win 2 races, they win it by a mile. It's not even close. In 1881, the Canadians come back. Everyone's a bit surprised, but still
with the Countess?
Yeah, well, they come back with a different one. And this is... The English are still not even challenging. So the Americans are having to take these challenges from the Canadians, even though they don't really want to.
Yes.
So this is 5 years later. The Canadians say, we'll challenge again. This one's from the Bay of Quinte Yacht Club, which is also on Lake Ontario. And this time they build a ship. It's called the Atalanta. And its preparation is even more rushed. So her planking was not planed down. Like it was just someone had hammered bits of wood. And her fittings were unfinished.
Was it seaworthy?
Well, money was so lacking that work had to stop several times while the Canadians waited for cash. So this was when the boat sailed down the Bay of Quinte, the crew was still nailing down her deck. That's not filling you with confidence if someone's making the boat while sailing it, I would say. It's sort of not what you want to see. The sails were all fitting. It was all over it. So they had no time to actually sail. Right. The way you normally get to the yacht race, to the New York, is from Canada, is you sail, there's a St. Lawrence ocean course that you can go out. You can go out to the sea. Sort of there's an entrance to the sea. Yeah. And then you sail down to New York. So past Nova Scotia, that sort of area of the world. They didn't have time to do it. So instead they entered the Erie Canal. They went through a man-made canal to get to New York, right? But the ship was too big for the canal.
This is half-assed.
So the crew shifted the ballast to one side, and so she was leaning on her side. So it's sort of like a car going up on 2 wheels to get through an alley or something. It's total shambles. Then a team of mules towed the boat.
She's like the African queen now.
And so it showed the muddy bottom of the boat to everyone because it was up on its side. And so it got the nickname the Canadian Mud Turtle, was what everyone called it, right?
That doesn't sound fast.
No one is thinking this is like a good thing. So it turns up, it's facing a ship called Mischief, which is the second ever all metal boat built in the USA. So, but the first racing one. So you've got the Canadian Mud Turtle that's been pulled by mules.
And running late.
And still being built up against this scientifically designed. This is one
futuristic.
This is one of the first scientifically designed boats, the Mischief. Like instead of just old wooden craftsmen looking at and thinking, this is like they've done the measuring, they've done the factory making. This is the power of the American industrial system starting to be brought to bear on their yacht. So it's not even. It's not even vaguely close. She just wins. It's described in the New York Times as a procession and that even the locals were not interested. This was just boring. What it does do is when it finishes, they go back to George Schuyler and they say, can you rejig the deed of gift again and change the rules again?
Yes.
And this is just constant of the Americans, how can we change the rules again? So he's the only one still alive from the American syndicate. So his word is it's like God.
Yeah,
it's like being able to take the Ten Commandments tablets back to God and going, could you get rid of the one about coveting your neighbour's ox?
Rewrite number 8.
Yeah, rewrite. I don't like number 8. So they rewrite it again, and what they do is they go to him and say, what we want is vessels competing in the Cup have to make it to the New York under their own sail. They can't go down. They can't be dragged by mules down a canal.
Sure.
They have to sail to the thing. Yeah. Now, what's interesting about this is they're sort of doing this because they're worried that the Canadians are just going to keep sending these boats that can't handle the ocean. But it also creates a thing that helps the Americans, and it's unsure whether they thought of this at the time or later, but it means that anyone challenging from, say, Australia or England or all these places have to sail to New York. So they have to build a ship that can cross the Atlantic and then race in New York, where the New York boats don't have to cross the Atlantic. So the Americans are building
focused solely on
a rate how fast it
ship.
is, and that doesn't need to be as strong. So this is a real bonus. So that's one of the changes in this deed.
Incredible.
That they're stacking the deck, right, for them. There was also another one, though, and this was a bit which sets up for today. There was a new paragraph about mutual consent, which says the parties intending to sail for the Cup may, by mutual consent, make any agreement satisfactory to both as to the date, course, time allowance, number of trials, rules, and sailing regulations. So basically, it's becoming more you challenge, and if we both agree to something, so we both agree it's a best of 5 or a best of 7, or...
But the Americans still have the whip hand because they can choose to agree or not to agree based on what they say.
And the thing in sailing, I don't think I said this in the first 2 episodes, home field advantage in sailing is huge.
Yeah.
So boats made for the British Isles are very different to boats because they've got deeper, choppier waters, where America tends to be like estuaries and things like that.
Yes.
So you got a massive advantage, right? So they do this, though, and the mutual consent is seen as a fairer thing, though, because at least you both get to negotiate and agree on the race terms before. It still takes another 3 years, but in 1885, a challenge comes on behalf of the Royal Yacht Squadron.
From where?
In England.
England are back.
It's England are back. They say, and not only 2 come through, 2 challenges, one from 1885 and one for 1886. So suddenly the New York Yacht Club are going, we're back in business. We've learned from the Canadian experience. We've made the deed a little fairer, a little unfairer in one way, a little fairer in another way.
Yeah.
The English is going, all right, we'll have a crack now that we can negotiate a bit about what it's going to be. So 1886, this is my favourite challenge of all time. Right?
Here we go.
Comes from the Royal Northern Yacht Club in Scotland. And it's from actually an Irishman who's the captain. So you have to challenge through a club, and he's a member of this.
So this is the Irish Challenger.
Well, it's an Irish guy leading it, but it's through a Scottish yacht
Scottish?
club. Yeah, so... And so the Scots are now having a go.
Are they famous for seagoing? Are they?
Yeah, I mean, it's very... Yeah, the Scots and the English, all huge things. Yeah. So the guy that's challenging through the Royal Northern Yacht Club in Scotland, and he's a member of that club, he was born in Ireland. His name's Lieutenant William Paddy Henn, right?
Yes.
So he was born in Dublin in 1847, and his father's a huge landowner in County Clare. So he's got a lot of money, landed gentry.
Yep.
At the age of 13, and I think he's sort of like, often the second or third son. If you're not going to inherit the whole thing, you kind of get sent off to the Navy. So at 13, he enters the Royal Navy.
Yeah.
Right? And he's a cadet above the HMS Trafalgar. And between 1862 and 1866, he then gets moved on to another ship called the Galatea. And at the time, it's one of the fastest ships in the Royal Navy. Mm-hmm. It actually goes up to America during the Civil War and sails through the Gulf of Mexico and, sort of hangs around the Civil War. Doesn't do much then, but... He then goes but he's been to the Civil War, so he's seen things even as a young kid, right? I mean, being a Navy guy from 13.
He's got some life experience under the belt.
He's then in 1866, he's on some Royal Navy ships that lay the transatlantic cable. So this is the telegram cable. Yep. So the first ever. He's part of that. So he's part of history all the time. He's then a sub-lieutenant on the HMS Daphne. Now it serves in the East Indies and along the African coast. Now it is a ship along with its got two sister ships, the Dryad and the Nymph. They're part of this new Amazon class. So these are steam screw sloops. So they're sailing ships, but they also have a steam engine, right? They're the fastest...
Hybrids.
Yeah, they are. They're like a hybrid. They're the Prius of their...
Yes, that's right.
So these are the fastest ships the British Navy have at the time, and he's on one of them. And they become the weapon against the fight against the slave trade in East Africa. So when the British decide... Enough's enough, and actually ban slavery and actually do a lot to end it, he's on one of the ship, and their job is chasing down slave ships.
Right.
And he personally shows great bravery doing this and capturing these ships. In one vessel he brought alongside and overtook, there were 156 men, women and children on it, which he rescued. And they estimate he was part of operations that rescued thousands of African slaves.
Good on him.
So, this is a guy who's been to the Civil War, the transatlantic cable. He's part of fighting the slave trade.
He's out and about.
In 1872, he's second in command of the expedition that goes to Africa to find the explorer Livingstone with Henry Stanley. He's part of that one, the one funded by Gordon Bennett, our friend who used to race, the newspaper proprietor used to race naked. I remember he funded that one.
Of course.
So he's on that too. He finally retires in 1874. He's a lieutenant when he retires. And he decides that he's going to just pursue his love of sailing. And he can do this because the rents collected from his family has got 7,660 acres in County Clare. So he's rich for the rest of his life. Yeah. So he sets off to the Mediterranean and he's just living a life of sailing around on a ship. That's all he's doing.
Well played.
He then meets his wife. Her name is Susan Matilda Cunningham Graham Bartholomew.
They didn't muck around in those days, did they?
So Susan, as we'll call her.
Yes.
So she's an amazing lady. She's born on 11th of June 1853 in Scotland. And her family's descended from a bunch of earls. And her grandfather was a wealthy cotton spinner who'd made a huge fortune. So she had... on one hand, the aristocracy, on the other hand, this new money coming in. So she was filthy rich.
She's a good catch.
Good catch. Her mother died when she was 2 years old. And so they were brought up by their father. They had huge houses, nurses, servants, butlers, governesses.
He's retired and sailing.
Yeah.
He's a good life.
He's retired. So we don't know much about her early life, but then her and her brother are sailing in the Mediterranean in a small yacht in 1877. So... William Henn has only just retired 3 years before. And they meet William Henn and they just instantly fall in love. And so it's a true love for the rest of their lives, right? So she decides they get married a few years later and then she moves in with him on his boat, the Gertrude. And this is very unusual. A man and woman even married living on a boat. And she becomes a full proper sailor into all of this, even though she's this aristocrat, well-brought-up woman, but she's can sail a boat.
Was it frowned upon? Was it seemed beneath her?
It was just seen weird, like she was this adventurer, But you'll find out in a second, William and Susan didn't care what people really thought of them and were incredibly likeable. Everyone liked them, even though they were... So they start, they're members of the Club Nautique de Nice in France, and they spend their whole life just sailing around the Mediterranean Sea and the coasts of Ireland and Britain. They then have bought a ship called the Galatea, which is named after his former Navy ship.
Yes.
And they decide, well, why don't we challenge for the America's Cup?
Fair call.
So
got
they
a bit
do.
of spare time on their hands.
Now, the Galatea was the sister ship of the Gnesta, who had raced the year before and gone very close.
Yes.
But the difference was while the Gnesta was built to be a racing ship, the Galatea wasn't really. She was clumsy and she had a huge lead keel. But they went over anyway, and they sailed across the Atlantic, and that made Susan Henn the first woman to ever cross the Atlantic in a racing yacht. They arrive in New York, and the sailors at the New York Yacht Club are shocked for several reasons. First, the ship's totally set up for leisure cruising, right?
Right.
Susan Henn funds a lot of this because she's got a lot of money. So does her husband, but she has a passion for below deck furnishings. So the Galateas, they live on board. The Galatea's living room looked like the interior of a British castle, right?
It's hilarious.
Solid wood furniture.
Yep.
Mahogany panelling, mirrors, paintings, lace curtains, rich drapes, crystals, plates everywhere, an iron fireplace, potted palms, and a leopard skin on the floor.
A fireplace on a boat is still
Hilarious.
blowing my mind.
And it's a big iron fireplace. So they don't even take all this off for the race. They leave all this on. They even tow their dinghy behind them as they race.
Good Lord.
So they are not... This is the most half-assed
Yeah.
attempt at racing, right? They don't have a proper racing crew. They've got a crew that works on their ship when they're cruising.
Yeah,
They
the
keep
crew's
them.
very comfy downstairs, I'd suggest.
Yeah. Before the race, the Henns become socialites in New York City, and they become so popular that everyone loves them, except the New York Yacht Club are a bit like, this is not conducive to a great race. They make so many new friends. All their friends start bringing them gifts, like they know that she loves pot plants, so that just weighs the boat down even more. So you got to remember, they're up against the Boston
Got you a potted palm
Syndicate.
tree. Thanks.
They're up against the Boston Syndicate,
Yeah.
who are ruthless, like will shave an inch off the top
They're all
of the
over
deck to get the weight down. And these guys have an iron fireplace
And a dinghy.
and a dinghy out the back. Now, the second thing that shocked the New York Yacht Club was the fact that on board the boat, as well as all this downstairs, is kind of a floating zoo on board.
What do you mean?
The Henns travelled with 5 dogs, a cat, a lemur, a raccoon, and an official mascot of the ship, a monkey named Peggy, who wore a pullover and a hat with Galatea and the Royal Northern Yacht Clubs on it.
This is like a Noah.
It's like
Somebody-
Dr. Dolittle shot.
2 of every animal.
So, the Americans are very serious about all that going.
So what, there's livestock running around the
Yeah,
deck.
5 dogs, a cat, a lemur, a raccoon, and a monkey called Peggy. And the monkey knew how to sail. The monkey used to could be seen during the cup racing, pulling on the ropes and jumping up and
Tighten
down.
the jib, little
Yeah,
fella. There's
knew,
a banana in it.
It knew what to do. It knew how to pull the ropes in the right time, so they would send it to do things. And when they were winning, if they were ever winning, it would run onto the head. It would run onto the bow sprint at the front and cheer and clap. It knew what racing was. So it becomes...
Oh, this is fantastic.
One American reporter wrote during one of the races, only Peggy the monkey seemed to know what to do and leapt along Galatea's lengthy bowsprit determined to lower the sails. Anyway, so this is all showed up. The race itself was against a boat called the Mayflower, which was the Boston Syndicate again. Now, you won't be shocked, but the Mayflower just absolutely creamed Galatea. Yeah. It won the 2 races easily. Wasn't even really a race. After the races, though, the Henns, continue to charm the Americans. They hang around. The Americans love them.
Yeah.
And for the next 8 years, they sail around the Florida Keys and the Gulf of Mexico having a marvellous time. Just prior to returning to England, Peggy the monkey passes away, which is sad.
Sea burial, was it?
So much respect to the American captains have for her that she's wrapped in a Union Jack and carried by 4 American skippers from nearby yachts and given a proper burial at sea.
This is the greatest chapter yet of the America's Cup.
Oh, it's
I had
like-
no idea about this.
Don't you think this is what they should have now? Is like you have to have some sort of animal on board?
Totally. It has to be named.
Yeah.
Be part of it.
I reckon a whole ship should be just manned by monkeys. Now, at the very end of this being put in place, which infuriates everyone, but it's the new deed, on 1890, George Schuyler finally dies of heart trouble. He's on board the Commodore's yacht in New York Harbour when he dies. And this is the last of the original American syndicate are left alive, and he's passed away. and it suddenly means there's no more being able to go back and alter the deal in that way, the deed of gift anyway. And it means any future changes are going to be settled by legal challenges.
Oh, God.
And we might open up another door. That point.
Do they bury him, sea burial for George
They
next
got
to the monkey?
4 monkeys out.
All right, here we go. We enter another exciting chapter, the court system.
And this is where
what year are we up to right now?
Seriously, we're just entering the 20th century, so into the 19th. This is where we're going to have our favourite challenger of all time, Sir Thomas Lipton, who the tea magnet. It's going to get wild.
Cannot wait. Thank you again.